Hi, my name is Jared Quinn, and we're hanging out in my backyard today to introduce you to a book that just came out from Stylus Publishing called The Learner-Centered Instructional Designer. Now, this book is for anyone who works to build online classes in higher ed. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the book, and then we're going to go into about who created the book and where they're coming from. And lastly, we're going to go kind of almost chapter by chapter through a synopsis of the book so you can see if it's going to be a great fit for your library, for yourself, or for any instructional designer in your life. So while written with instructional designers in mind, it's really for anybody who plays a role in creating online courses in higher ed. So educational technologists, learning designers, educational developers, and yes, maybe even perhaps instructional designers. This book was written to be a handbook of sorts, something you can reference that really is connected to the daily work of instructional design and building online classes. It starts with a look at kind of what is the job of instructional design in academia, and then it moves on to the biggest tension in our work as designers, building trust with the instructors we work with. The third section is all about how we learn. What are these frameworks that guide how we learn as people? So universal design for learning, metacognition, motivation, things like that. And the last section is one we call practical evergreens. It's what are those kind of main and the plain approaches for online courses, no matter what system you're using, things like discussion forums, multimedia, pieces like that. So that's the book in a nutshell. I was very fortunate to be able to work on this project with about 20 other instructional designers from across the country. We've got folks from New York, from Pennsylvania, from Georgia, from Texas, from Missouri, from Ohio, from Nevada, from California, from Washington, all over the place. And that was very intentional because the goal was to reflect the expertise and the diversity of our field, but also to reflect the various experiences of instructional designers in higher ed. So it hopefully shows you the dynamic, how dynamic our discipline that we get to be a part of is, while sharing some stories from the field that you can relate to. So let's talk a little bit about the book itself. The book is broken up into 4 overarching sections with multiple chapters in each section kind of going into the details. So the first section is called Instructional Design in Academia, a common core with different approaches. In this part, we look in depth at the 2 main models of instructional design, the Concierge model and the Consultation model. So the Concierge model is really common in those institutions with thousands and thousands of online classes they've got to design, build, manage, and create. It's where the instructional designer works with the instructor or the subject matter expert to build the course. And they do a lot of the heavy lifting of the actual building, but also the project management. Now, the Consultation model is where the instructional designer acts as a consultant. So they work with the instructor with the goal of helping the instructor drive their own course. And so with that framework in mind, it's always thinking, at the end of the day, for better or for worse, this course is the instructor's and they need to own it. And so from there, the next section is called Building Faculty Trust, or you can trust me, I'm a professional. Any research into the work of instructional designers in higher ed always points back to the same primary tension. It is not funding. That comes next. That's the second. But the primary one is building trust with instructors. The thing is, the work we do requires us to build trust quickly and deeply if we're going to help instructors to create something great. And so this section talks about all different ways and approaches we can use to build that trust. So from setting the environment, creating a space that's conducive to trust, to having and enforcing professional boundaries. So every instructional designer will get questions like, hey, how do I set up my home Wi-Fi router? That's not our job, but we can still help the person find help without being that help, and knowing what roles we play and enforcing those roles. We also talk about, we have a great chapter from a faculty member who's worked with a few different instructional designers over a few years, over a few projects. And they talk about what it's like to be on the other end of that consultation, what it's like to kind of feel like this thing, this course you've created, this baby of yours is being challenged and pushed and provoked to be something else. It's a great perspective that I think we as instructional designers really need to know. And lastly, if we are going to be trustworthy in our work, we need to know what we're talking about. For real, we really need to know what we're talking about. We need to learn on the research of teaching and learning and how those things work. But it's not just the research itself that matters. It's the emotions that come along with what happens when we see that research and we're challenged to do new practices, to do something new and scary. So the third section, part 3, is called Frameworks That Touch Everything, or the lenses we work with. So we begin this section by asking a question that we hear a lot from faculty, but we want to take some time to really dig deep. Does this online learning thing actually work? Can you learn at a distance in front of a machine? Is that even possible? And then we go into, here's, spoiler alert, yes. Otherwise we probably wouldn't be in this field or doing this work. But then we go into another framework that you might be familiar with called Universal Design for Learning. And we not just talk about practical approaches of implementing UDL, but what might happen if we as instructional designers start doing this in all of our work, in all of our consultations. When we make our courses more inclusive to more people, how many learners' lives does that affect? And as long as we're talking about being inclusive, we also want to talk, we got to have the hard talk about decentralizing whiteness in online learning and what is the role of the instructional designer in that work. And then we talk a little bit about motivation. The next chapter is on motivation and the things we can do in a course that encourages learners to dig deep and the things that push them away. And from motivation, we move on to metacognition, but it's not just the metacognition reflection for the learner's sake. So what they can do to help their learning. We also turn the tables on the instructional designer a bit and say, all right, in your work as an instructional designer, how can you use metacognition to be a better practitioner? So from metacognition, we move into technology. We're instructional designers. We're often gadgety people, and that's great. And so when we talk about gadgets and technology, what do we do with that never-ending flow? There's always something new out there. And so this chapter looks into making sure you know your objectives, you know your values, you know your purpose, and finding a technology that fits, that enhances that purpose and gets out of the way of learning. And if it doesn't, well, it's got to go. The last part is called Components of Online Classes, Practical Evergreens. So again, we don't go into the specifics about what buttons to push when. IDs are really great about figuring out the how of these pieces, how to use these things. What we talk about in this section is the why of using these approaches. So the first one is course structure. How does our course structure influence learning in the course? Does our flow, does our model, does ownership of creating that structure change the experience? Then we look at multimedia, and it's not just how do we make something that somebody will watch? You know, how do we make a video that the students actually watch and enjoy and learn something from? But it's also, well, what are you doing before that video? What are you doing after that video? All of it works together to create a really rich learning experience. And then comes the great conversation about collaborative work online, or as I often put it, how do you do an online group project that's not terrible? This may be a trick question. You'll have to read this chapter to find out. And then in this age of remote learning, synchronous experiences have become way more common. And so we have a chapter on synchronous learning, but it takes a little different approach, always looking to be how can the learners be the ones doing most of the talking in a synchronous course? How can you shape that experience to it's very learner-powered and learner-centered? And with any conversation about online classes in higher ed, We have to talk about our love-hate relationship with discussion forums. So the thing about discussion forums is they've been around since like the dawn of online learning. Have they outlived their usefulness? Is there something more than post once, reply twice? Are we missing something that could actually be really magical with this tool? And we can't have a chapter about online course design and development without talking about the actual teaching of the course. You can have everything in alignment. You can pass all of the quality reviews. You can get everything working together in beautiful harmony. But instructor presence matters. Instructor presence makes, breaks the online learning experience. So what's our role as instructional designers in helping guide that? We also have a chapter on remote instructional design. So right now I'm in my backyard because I'm working from home, like many of you may be doing. And so how has this shift affected our work? Did we figure out that those meetings really could have been emails? That's one piece of it. But there's another. Most of the chapter talks more about the experience, a little bit of the stress and the self-care that may come along with a sudden change in how we work. But it also talks about, well, what are there course designs that are more resilient? Ones that if the instructor has to take care of a sick family member and has to go online immediately, can you have a course design that facilitates that quickly and easily? And this chapter gives several examples of frameworks that do just that. So the last part of the book is a wrap-up. Ties all of these pieces together and really looks at how do we find our people? How do we find our community as instructional designers? How do we keep learning ourselves and get better at our work and not get complacent? But also, I take a minute to introduce you to something that's been very deeply meaningful and super challenging in my own work. Critical digital pedagogy. We talk a little bit about that, and hopefully I can encourage you to dig deeper into it. That's the book. 20 chapters focused on instructional design, building online courses in higher ed. And I'm really excited about this. This has been an incredible passion project. So here's the deal. I've been doing this for a decade. When I started, I'll just be straight with you, I knew absolutely nothing. I once asked my director a year into the job, why on earth did you hire me? Because I'm clearly the dumbest kid on the block here. She was really great about that, by the way. She said, you can learn the stuff, values. When you have matching values, that's when a team works. And so I was part of a great team that patiently and generously helped me learn the technology, the pedagogy, and the skills to be an effective instructional designer. I wanted to make this book for that reason, because I wanted you to be able to have those same conversations with those same colleagues that I was privileged to have in my own work. I want you to hear from your colleagues who've been doing this and have great skill and thoughts about how we could go about our daily work to have really meaningful careers and do cool things. So I hope this book can become kind of a well-loved handbook, a well marked up, written in, useful guide for your work in becoming and remaining an evidence-based, fiercely creative, and always learner-centered instructional designer. Thanks.